we're exploring the most shocking and disturbing deaths ever recorded during extreme world record attempts. From a free solo slackliner plunging 1,200 feet in Norway to a high-altitude wingsuit jump gone tragically wrong over the Idaho desert, each story shows just how far humans will push the limits and how quickly ambition can turn deadly. These aren't just accidents. They are harrowing reminders of the razor-thin line between daring and disaster. Number 8. Lucas Fair, the free solo highline fall. It was August 19, 2015, in Norway's remote Rome Valley, a place so quiet that even the wind seemed to move with intention. Sheer cliffs framed a narrow gorge where dark water cut through granite far below, carving the land into a deep, unforgiving seam. Just after noon, a small group gathered on a rocky ridge, speaking little. At the edge stood one man, barefoot, toes gripping stone, eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. Lucas Fair was 29 years old. A structural engineer from Cologne, he spent most of his year immersed in calculations, load tolerances, and stress limits. But every summer, he vanished into the Alps, trading blueprints for webbing lines stretched between mountains. Among highliners, Lucas was known for two things: an almost unnerving calm under pressure, and a belief that simplicity was safety. No excess gear, no shortcuts, only what was absolutely necessary. Highlining at its core is tightrope walking taken to an extreme. Athletes balance on a strip of webbing barely wider than a hand, suspended hundreds or thousands of feet above open space. Every movement matters. Every gust of wind becomes an opponent. Most highliners wear a tether clipped to the line, a thin leash that turns a fall into a swing. Lucas had used one for years. Lately, though, he'd begun leaving it behind. For him, free soloing wasn't about bravado. It wasn't rebellion or ego. Lucas believed risk could be managed, even mastered, if you understood it deeply enough. Control, he once told a friend, comes from knowing exactly what can kill you. That philosophy cost him sponsors. As soon as he began declining harnesses, brands quietly stepped away. But an Austrian film collective agreed to document his next attempt, drawn by the purity of the idea. Lucas wasn't bothered by the lack of commercial backing. He'd chosen the line himself and helped design every part of it. The highline stretched 4,300 feet across Rome Valley, suspended roughly 1,200 feet above the gorge floor. Lucas selected the location precisely because it was empty. There were no base jumpers, drones, or crowds, just granite walls, open air, and wind that behaved however it pleased. He personally inspected and triple-checked each anchor bolt, calculating load paths and redundancy with an engineer's obsession. If anything failed, he wanted to know it wouldn't be the equipment. The goal was simple, at least on paper: walk the longest free solo highline ever attempted. Training for it had been meticulous. Lucas isolated sections of similar lines, rehearsed balance corrections, and practiced reading wind shifts through subtle changes in webbing tension. He knew the weather would never be perfect. That was part of the challenge. On the morning of the attempt, conditions were clear but unstable. Long stretches of calm air punctuated by sharp, unpredictable gusts. Nothing unusual for the valley. Nothing, in his mind, unmanageable. At 10 minutes past 12 p.m., Lucas stepped onto the line. Observers said he moved with the same steady rhythm they'd seen dozens of times before. His feet rolled gently along the webbing, knees bent, arms relaxed but ready. Around 1,400 feet in, the line began to sway in a slow, wide lateral arc. Lucas crouched low, lowering his center of gravity, letting the oscillation pass. He waited. The wind eased. He stood and continued. No one realized it then, but it was the last time he would stand upright. Near the 1,500-foot mark, a stronger gust tore through the gorge. It hit from the side, fast and uneven. Lucas's torso pitched left, arms snapping outward as he tried to counterbalance. He lunged instinctively, but his foot landed just off-center on the moving webbing. For a fraction of a second, he hovered, arms frozen, spine arched, body suspended between recovery and failure. Then the balance broke. He dropped like a snapped wire. His body spun once in freefall before vanishing into the granite throat of the gorge. The sound never reached the far cliffs, swallowed by distance and wind. Halfway down, he struck a jagged outcrop, the impact violent enough to deflect his fall. Witnesses later described a sharp, echoing crack that cut across the valley. His body continued downward, tumbling until it hit the boulder-strewn base below. Searchers, guided by drone footage and triangulation from the opposite ridge, found him hours later. The injuries were catastrophic. His spine was fractured in multiple places, his pelvis crushed, both legs twisted at unnatural angles. The coroner ruled the trauma non-survivable, consistent with a near-vertical fall at terminal velocity. There were no signs of movement after impact. Lucas's family held a private service in Cologne. Friends traveled from Germany, Austria, and Italy, slackliners, climbers, people who had trusted him with their own lives on lines strung between peaks. Norwegian authorities closed no trails. They issued no fines. No recommendations followed. Lucas had signed liability waivers and violated no regulations. In the eyes of the law, nothing had gone wrong. In the eyes of everyone who watched him fall, everything had. From silence and air, the next record attempt traded balance for velocity, and the margin for error shrank totally disappeared in a second. Number 7. Alyssa Hartmann, rocket-assisted land speed cycling. It was October 3, 2015, and the Bonneville Salt Flats looked deceptively calm. No rippling wind, no dust devils. Just an endless white sheet stretching to the horizon under a hard blue Utah sky. The kind of stillness that makes everything feel controllable, right up until it isn't. In the distance, the low growl of a modified pace car rolled across the flats. Behind it, tethered by a tow line, was Alyssa Hartmann, 32 years old, crouched low on a carbon fiber bicycle that looked less like a bike and more like a missile with pedals. She was waiting for the release point, waiting for speed to take over. Alyssa wasn't a daredevil in the traditional sense. She didn't chase records for applause or viral clips. Her path into land speed cycling started quietly, weaving through traffic as a bike courier in Seattle. Years of threading narrow gaps at speed sharpened her instincts. Eventually, curiosity replaced adrenaline. She went back to school, earned a mechanical engineering degree, and began asking a dangerous question. How fast could a bicycle really go? Land speed cycling lives at the fringe of engineering and insanity. Riders pilot custom machines across desert flats, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour with rocket assistance. At those velocities, a loose bolt or delayed correction doesn't cause a crash, it causes an ending. Alyssa understood that better than most. She built her professional life around experimental design, consulting for small aerospace firms while quietly drafting her own high-speed prototypes at night. Her final machine represented 5 years of iteration. A carbon fiber monocoque frame, a rocket-assisted rear assembly, manually controlled stabilizers designed to counter yaw at extreme speed. The project was crowdfunded, partly self-financed, and supported by a regional engineering grant. Friends described her as methodical to the point of obsession. She described herself as careful, not fearless. The plan was extreme but precise. A modified drag car would tow her to 110 meters per hour over 2 miles. At release, she'd stabilize the bike manually, then ignite twin microthrusters to push past 180 meters per hour over the remaining 6 miles. Bonneville was chosen for a reason: flat, open, dry, and forgiving, by high-speed standards anyway. She had already completed 4 prior runs under 160 meters per hour without incident. Her team was small but experienced: 2 engineers, a paramedic, and a pace car driver familiar with land speed protocols. They ran checklists obsessively. Still, the flats had changed. Recent rainfall subtly shifted the surface, and some boundary markers had been repositioned farther from the center line. GPS data suggested stability. Visually, everything looked fine. At 10:20 a.m., she launched. The tow was clean. At mile 3, Alyssa released smoothly. The bike tracked straight, cameras showing her tucked posture and relaxed arms, managing drag exactly as designed. At mile 5, telemetry flagged a wobble in the left stabilizer. Small, but wrong. Her spotter radioed an immediate abort. Alyssa didn't respond. She was already traveling too fast for safe braking. Sudden deceleration or correction at that speed could be just as lethal as continuing. The front wheel began to oscillate, barely at first, then visibly. She held the line, riding the instability, committing to the run. Then the stabilizer failed. The bike yawed violently. The thrusters fired milliseconds later, turning instability into catastrophe. Alyssa was hurled forward, her body separating from the bike as fragments scattered across the salt. Witnesses described the impact as a dull, percussive thud, more felt than heard, followed by a cloud of white dust erupting where she hit. She struck chest first at a shallow angle, sliding across the crusted surface like a thrown object. The force tore through her protective suit. Her helmet split on impact. The coroner later confirmed multiple skull fractures, a shattered rib cage, collapsed lungs, and compound fractures in all 4 limbs. Death was instantaneous. Paramedics reached her within a minute. There was nothing to do. Her family held a quiet memorial near Bainbridge Island, scattering her ashes over Puget Sound. In the aftermath, the Bureau of Land Management suspended all unofficial speed trials at Bonneville pending new site markings and structural reviews. The land speed cycling community mourned deeply. Alyssa wasn't reckless, she was precise, and that made the loss harder to accept. Speed ends things quickly. Height, however, gives you time, sometimes miles of air, to realize something has gone irreversibly wrong. Number 6. Franz Reichelt, the Eiffel Tower parachute jump. Born in Austria and later working in France, Reichelt was a tailor by trade and an inventor by obsession. In the early 1990s, aviation was advancing faster than safety could keep up. Pilots flew fragile aircraft with little more than courage and luck keeping them alive. Reichelt became fixated on one idea: a wearable parachute that could be integrated into a pilot's clothing. No bulky packs, no separate deployment, just a suit that could turn a fall into a controlled descent. He worked obsessively, stitching fabric, folding panels, testing designs by dropping mannequins from windows. The results were inconsistent. Most tests failed. But Reichelt convinced himself that altitude was the missing ingredient. More height, more air, more time for the suit to open. He wanted a real test, a historic one. On February 4, 1912, Reichelt arrived at the Eiffel Tower in Paris, carrying his latest invention, a parachute suit weighing roughly 20 kilograms. Authorities had granted permission for a test under the assumption that a dummy would be used. Reporters gathered. Cameras rolled. What no one realized until it was too late was that Reichelt intended to jump himself. Climbing to the first platform, roughly 57 meters above the frozen ground, he stepped onto a small table placed near the railing. Witnesses later recalled his hesitation. He adjusted the suit, checked the wind. I looked down. Someone reportedly shouted for him to stop. Then he jumped. The suit never deployed. There was no billowing fabric, no sudden drag, no moment of lift. Reichelt fell almost vertically, his body tight against the failed design. The descent lasted only a few seconds. He struck the frozen ground at near-terminal velocity, leaving a visible crater on impact. Death was instantaneous. The autopsy documented massive blunt force trauma, shattered bones, crushed organs, no signs of survival. The footage of the jump, captured by early motion cameras, spread quickly and horrified the public. For many, it was the first time death had been recorded so starkly, frame by frame. Reichelt's failure didn't end experimentation, but it changed how it was approached. Aviation authorities began tightening safety regulations. Parachute testing shifted toward unmanned trials and staged deployments. His death became a grim lesson taught to engineers and designers. Belief does not replace physics. More than a century later, the footage is still studied. Not for spectacle, but as a reminder. Innovation can push boundaries. Gravity does not negotiate. If early aviation proved gravity's cruelty, modern technology convinced others they could finally outthink it. Number 5. Travis Dale, Stratospheric Wingsuit Failure. It was October 21, 2016, just after sunrise, when the plains outside Pocatello began to glow faint pink. Frost clung to sagebrush. The air was still. In the middle of an empty field, a helium balloon the size of a grain silo loomed above a support truck, its skin whispering softly as it strained against its tethers. Everything about the morning felt cooperative, almost inviting. Beneath the balloon, Travis Dale climbed into a pressurized capsule while 3 others watched from a careful distance. No rushing, no last-minute panic. This was a man who hated improvisation. Wind was minimal, visibility was perfect. On paper, it was exactly the day you'd pick to flirt with the edge of the atmosphere. Travis was 30 years old, a former Army parachute rigger from Utah, who had spent years making sure other people's gear didn't fail. After leaving the military, he built a niche career doing technical consulting for commercials, stunt productions, and thrill-seeking YouTubers who wanted to go bigger, but not die doing it. Friends described him as obsessively methodical. His workshop walls were plastered with pressure charts, failure trees, and handwritten notes in different colors. Gear logs filled binders. Nothing went undocumented. Among base jumpers, Travis had a reputation for clean exits and smooth canopy rides. But his real obsession was wingsuit flying, the closest thing humans have to becoming guided projectiles. In a wingsuit, there's no margin for hesitation. Athletes fall forward at speeds topping 120 miles per hour, carving air with fabric stretched between their arms and legs. Body position isn't just important, it's everything. A twitch at the wrong moment can turn flight into chaos. Travis believed flight was a solvable equation, and like many engineers before him, he believed the equation could be pushed further. For 2 years, he worked toward a goal most wingsuit pilots wouldn't touch: launching directly from the stratosphere using a weather balloon. No aircraft, no runway, just altitude, fabric, and math. The capsule was built from surplus military schematics, modified with automated venting valves, internal oxygen, and a sealed pressure hatch. It had been tested unmanned multiple times. The system worked, at least on paper. His wingsuit was equally ambitious: reinforced fabric, carbon fiber internal stiffeners, modifications designed to stabilize early deployment in thin air where traditional aerodynamics barely apply. The plan was a clean exit at 41,000 feet, well above commercial flight levels. Travis kept the operation deliberately quiet. He filed partial disclosures with authorities, careful not to trigger a full regulatory shutdown. The launch site sat beneath a remote slice of airspace. No transponder, no radar signature anyone was paying attention to. His ground crew was lean: 2 close friends and a spotter, tracking him via handheld radios and a commercial GPS beacon from an unmarked van near a dry lake bed. The balloon lifted off at dawn. By 7:52 a.m., the capsule had climbed to 40,800 feet. Travis radioed down, all systems normal. He depressurized the cabin, opened the hatch. Outside, the air was a brutal -60 degrees. Thin, unforgiving, beautiful. The moment he jumped, everyone watching knew something was wrong. Instead of transitioning into a stable glide, Travis pitched forward violently and began to spin. His radio cut out almost immediately. Then, in a cruel escalation, the left wing of his suit tore free. The shredded fabric would later be found nearly 3 miles downrange. Investigators concluded the failure was likely caused by lateral wind shear during exit, conditions impossible to fully replicate in ground tests. With one wing gone, symmetry vanished. Control vanished with it. Travis spiraled for more than 30,000 feet, shedding fragments of fabric as he fell. At 9,000 feet, his automatic activation device fired, deploying the reserve parachute. But the lines fouled in the torn remnants of the wingsuit. The canopy never fully inflated. He struck the canyon floor at an estimated 190 miles per hour. Death was instantaneous. His team called in the search, already knowing what they would find: debris, helmet pieces, fabric, parts of his body, were scattered across a roughly 60-foot radius. There was no emergency response to race against, only confirmation. Travis's memorial was held privately in Ogden. Fellow jumpers stood beside family and former Army friends. At the end of the service, a folded flag was presented to his mother. Within weeks, local authorities issued an emergency directive suspending private high-altitude balloon jumps. The order mandated a formal review of capsule exit procedures and required recertification for all wingsuit materials used above 30,000 feet. Travis Dale didn't fail because he was careless. He failed because some environments don't forgive innovation, even when it's calculated to the last decimal. But some innovators didn't want to fall from the sky. They wanted to build their own way up first. Number 4. Igor Leno, drone-assisted human flight death. It was January 27, 2018, and the desert outside Dubai was doing what deserts do best, looking calm while hiding absolutely nothing. The morning sun crept over the dunes, stretching long shadows across the sand as a low mechanical hum broke the silence. A reinforced drone platform lifted from a clearing in the Al Marmoum Desert, its rotors biting the air with a sound that felt more industrial than graceful. Suspended beneath it, strapped into a carbon fiber harness, was Igor Leno. At 26, Igor was an electrical engineer from Kharkiv who had relocated to the UAE after graduation. By day, he worked at a mid-tier drone firm in Sharjah, soldering flight control boards and debugging stabilization algorithms. By night, he chased a far stranger idea, using drones not just to film humans, but to lift them. Igor wasn't interested in transportation or convenience. His obsession was vertical freedom. He wanted to create a launch system that could lift a human straight into the sky and release them into a wingsuit flight. No cliffs, no aircraft, no helicopters. Just rotors, batteries, and math. Drone-assisted human flight sits in a dangerous gray zone. The idea is simple enough. A custom drone lifts a person to altitude, then disengages, allowing the pilot to transition into a wingsuit glide. In reality, it stacks multiple high-risk systems on top of each other: heavy lift drones, human weight, battery limits, manual release timing, fabric deployment. One failure anywhere in the chain can turn the whole thing lethal. Igor built his rig in a rented garage: overclocked industrial rotors, custom-stabilized arms, lithium polymer batteries scavenged from failed consumer models and reconfigured into high-output packs. He was meticulous, but he was also alone. The entire system weighed just under the UAE's 55-pound unmanned aerial vehicle limit, a deliberate choice that allowed him to operate without formal licensing. It was unofficial, unsanctioned, technically illegal. No aviation authority would approve a homemade manned drone flight. Staying under the weight limit let Igor bypass regulations and attempt the record on his own terms. Recognition didn't matter to him. Proof did. He wanted to show it could be done. Before this attempt, he had conducted partial tests up to 1,800 feet, always over empty desert, always early in the morning, and almost always alone. This time, 2 friends were present, monitoring telemetry on a laptop from the ground. The rig had no onboard AI correction. Igor insisted on full manual control. The plan was drilled endlessly: throttle up, ascend, hover check, manual disengage, wingsuit deployment, reserve parachute if needed. This attempt would go higher, 3,500 feet. At 6:41 a.m. the ascent began. The drone climbed smoothly, holding position as it passed 2,000 feet. Everything looked stable. At around 3,200 feet, the platform began to wobble. Telemetry later showed one motor overheating. Thinner air forced the rotors to work harder, and the sustained load pushed one beyond its thermal limits. From the ground, his friends watched the drone tilt forward. Igor disengaged early. He dropped cleanly but slightly sideways. They saw his wingsuit deploy, but not fully. One sleeve snagged on a harness buckle, creating asymmetry almost instantly. Instead of leveling out, Igor entered a tight, fast, flat spin. He fought it, twisting his body, trying to regain balance, but there was nothing to work with. At around 300 feet, observers saw him reach for his reserve chute. It deployed. It didn't inflate. The tangled fabric caught on the damaged wingsuit, collapsing the canopy before it could generate lift. At 9:46 a.m., Igor hit the sand headfirst at over 120 miles per hour. The impact drove his neck into his spine, crushing his skull instantly. The crater left behind was shallow but wide, surrounded by torn fabric and scattered components. Paramedics arrived quickly. There was nothing to be done. The medical examiner cited cervical fracture, blunt cranial trauma, and multiple vertebral breaks. 3 days later, Igor was buried in Kharkiv during a small, closed ceremony. His parents had flown to the UAE to identify and retrieve his remains. In the aftermath, local authorities issued emergency regulations banning all forms of drone-assisted human flight. A formal investigation into unauthorized experimental aviation activity followed, shutting down similar projects across the region. Igor Lino didn't die chasing fame. He died trying to shortcut gravity with hardware that was never meant to carry a human soul. After air and speed, the next record challenged something far older and far less forgiving: fire. Number 3. Jill Kinmont. Booth, gymnastics record gone wrong. Under the bright lights of a Los Angeles gymnasium, danger was the last thing anyone expected to see. The air smelled of chalk. Applause echoed off polished floors. Judges sat with clipboards, parents leaned forward in their seats, and teenage athletes stretched with nervous smiles. This was supposed to be the safe side of greatness: the controlled environment, the padded floors, the measured routines. That illusion shattered in 1955. Jill Kinmont Booth was 18 years old and already considered one of the most promising gymnasts in America. She wasn't just good, she was ahead of her time. At a point when women's gymnastics still emphasized elegance and restraint, Jill pushed difficulty. She chased bigger vaults, faster rotations, and higher risk. Coaches admired her fearlessness. Teammates watched her in quiet awe. She was training at the elite level, widely expected to compete at the 1956 Olympic Games. In an era before modern safety standards, before foam pits and reinforced vault tables, progress depended on athletes willing to go first, and Jill was always willing to go first. That day, she wasn't competing. There were no medals on the line. It was a training run, the kind athletes perform hundreds of times without thinking. But the vault she was practicing exceeded what was considered normal difficulty at the time. Higher entry speed, more aggressive hand placement, less room for error, and almost no protection. The vaulting horse was narrower and harder than modern equipment. Mats were thin by today's standards. Helmets were unheard of. Spotters stood nearby, but at full speed spotting was more hope than guarantee. Jill sprinted down the runway, planted her feet, and launched. Her hands missed the vault by inches. It was enough. Instead of redirecting her momentum upward, her body continued forward. She struck the apparatus awkwardly and pitched downward, landing head and neck first. The impact snapped her cervical spine. She didn't scream. She didn't move. The gym went silent. Medical responders arrived quickly, but the damage was irreversible. Jill Kinmont Booth was paralyzed from the neck down instantly. At 18, her gymnastics career ended before she could fully understand what had happened. She became a quadriplegic overnight. Jill lived another 36 years in a body that no longer obeyed her. The strength and precision that once defined her days were replaced by hospital routines, respiratory infections, and constant medical care. Yet she refused to disappear. She became a school teacher, working with children who never knew her as an athlete, only as someone patient, sharp, and quietly resilient. Still, the cost of that single vault never faded. Chronic complications from her spinal injury followed her for decades. In 2002, Jill died from medical issues directly linked to the trauma she sustained as a teenager, making her story inseparable from the long-term toll of record-pushing risk. Her accident sent shockwaves through the gymnastics world. Until then, severe injury was often dismissed as part of the sport. Jill's paralysis made that position impossible to defend. Coaches, federations, and equipment designers were forced to confront the reality that controlled environments could still fail catastrophically. Change followed, slowly but permanently. Vaulting equipment was redesigned to provide a larger, more forgiving surface. Landing mats became thicker and mandatory. Difficulty progression rules were revised to limit how quickly athletes could escalate risk. Spotting techniques improved. Safety became a discipline of its own, not an afterthought. Modern gymnastics, with its foam pits, spring floors, and layered protections, exists in part because Jill Kinmont Booth paid the price first. Her story is often overshadowed by instant fatalities, by dramatic falls from cliffs or blazing impacts at impossible speeds. But Jill's case reminds us of something more unsettling. Sometimes the body doesn't fail all at once. Sometimes it survives, long enough to carry the cost for decades. She didn't die chasing applause. She didn't fall from the sky or burn in a stunt gone wrong. She trusted a system that hadn't yet learned how dangerous progress could be. And she lived with that lesson for the rest of her life. And while some bodies fail instantly, others endure the cost of record chasing for decades. Los Angeles Times. Number 2. Marcus Lang, the 5-minute full-body burn. It was July 17, 2018. The late afternoon heat clung stubbornly to the concrete behind an abandoned warehouse lot on the outskirts of Bakersfield. A small, scattered crowd huddled behind makeshift tape lines, mostly indie filmmakers, camera operators, and a handful of stunt enthusiasts eager to capture something daring. At the center of the cleared area stood a man swathed in heavy flame-retardant layers, his face tight with concentration, shoulders stiff, fingers flexing as if already anticipating the fire to come. Marcus Lang, 36, a warehouse worker from Riverside, had spent years threading together a modest life between distribution center shifts and freelance stunt gigs. He dabbled in small-scale burns for student films, haunted attractions, and low-budget productions. All short stints, usually under 30 seconds, always with oxygen backups and a safety net. But Marcus wanted more, bigger, longer. The standing record for a full-body burn was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He wanted 5, not for fame, not for social media clout. For him, it was personal validation, a test of endurance and control against an unforgiving element. He had studied fire science obsessively, hours in the backyard experimenting with gel combinations, layering protective fabrics, testing suit materials, noting friction points and degradation patterns. His equipment was purchased out of pocket from a pyrotechnic supplier in Arizona. No official sponsors, no professional oversight, only a pair of assistants managing extinguishers and water tanks, and his own meticulous preparation guiding every step. The suit itself was 3 layers deep: cotton base, fire-resistant mid-layer, and a top coat of gel. His face had extra barrier cream, gloves reinforced. Even then he knew that fire was merciless. Small miscalculations could become catastrophic in seconds. At 4:30 p.m., the spark ignited. The flames crawled along his arms, across the chest, up his back, licking at the edges of his suit. For the first 2 minutes, Marcus remained eerily still, eyes fixed, shallow breaths under clenched teeth. It was a careful dance of patience and resolve, each second a test of nerves. By 2:45, subtle tremors ran through his knees. At 3 minutes, light coughing escaped him, barely audible beneath the roar of fire. The suit began to fail in places. High friction areas burned faster than expected, gel thinning against reality rather than lab predictions. Then came the fateful moment. A slight lean forward, an imperceptible shift in weight, and Marcus stumbled. The suit's protective layers had degraded faster than anticipated, leaving raw skin exposed to the licking flames. His gloves curled, revealing fingertips. Flames raced ahead of his movements, and despite the desperate intervention of his small crew, the fire overwhelmed him. Marcus collapsed forward, completely engulfed. Screams cut through the dry afternoon air. Short, sharp, then fading. 20+ seconds passed before he could be fully doused. By then, the damage was irreversible. Paramedics arrived minutes later. Marcus had suffered third-degree burns over 95% of his body. His airway was devastated by heat and smoke inhalation. He was rushed to the burn unit at Kurna Medical, ventilated, stabilized as best as possible, but the trauma was unsurvivable. Hours later, he succumbed to thermal injuries and respiratory failure. His cremation, held quietly in Riverside 4 days later, was brief, private, and somber. Authorities investigated and found the informal organizers negligent, issuing warnings against unsanctioned fire stunts without professional oversight. Marcus's ambition had pushed him to a personal and literal limit, a stark reminder that the pursuit of extreme records sometimes comes at the highest cost. Number 1. Sergei Artemov, high-altitude collapse. Sergei Artemov was a Russian mountaineer who lived for the extremes, the kind of climber who looked at the Himalayas and saw nothing but a personal stopwatch. Inspired by legends like Anatoly Bukriv, he was obsessed with speed records at high altitude, aiming to ascend the world's highest peaks without supplemental oxygen. To Artemov, every step was a calculation, every breath a test of endurance. He was precise, disciplined, and singularly focused, but also dangerously close to the limits of human physiology. In the spring of his fateful expedition, Artemov set out for a solo push on a Himalayan giant, targeting a record speed ascent above 8,000 meters. The sun had barely touched the icy ridges when he left camp, moving fast over jagged ice, thin snow, and sheer rock faces. He carried only minimal gear: lightweight crampons, a single ice axe, a thin layer of protective clothing, and his climbing boots worn to perfection. Every extra gram could slow him down. Every second counted. There were no ropes fixed in place, no supplemental oxygen to cushion his lungs against the merciless thin air. As he climbed, the mountain seemed almost sentient, each gust of wind a test, each ice patch a challenge. For Artemov, speed was safety. Faster meant less exposure to the harsh elements. But at this altitude, the air itself becomes an enemy. Oxygen levels plummet, heart rate spikes, judgment falters, every muscle screamed, and every breath felt like drawing from a straw barely half the diameter of normal. Above 8,000 meters, the brain is acutely sensitive to oxygen deprivation. Artemov's initial calm began to waver. The usual clarity of his mind became foggy. Decisions slowed. Simple calculations, which route to take, which footholds were safe, started to blur. Witnesses from base camp and later analysis would note that he likely hallucinated briefly, imagining stable terrain where none existed. The thin air didn't just steal his breath, it hijacked his mind. He missed key turnaround points. Minutes stretched into what seemed like hours in the cognitive haze induced by high-altitude cerebral edema, a silent killer that creeps in without warning. It is believed that Artemov slipped during a traverse, one misstep amplified by exhaustion, altitude, and the mountain's relentless slope. He fell over 3,000 feet along the Nuptse face, tumbling through ice and rock. The fall was instantaneous and brutal, leaving no chance for recovery. By the time Sherpas located his body days later, he was seated near the descent route, his climbing tools scattered around him. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an avalanche. Just the quiet tragedy of a body overcome by altitude. The mountaineering world was shaken. Artemov had been fast, fearless, and meticulous, yet even the most skilled climbers cannot outrun physics. His death sparked debates about the ethics of solo speed ascents at extreme altitude, particularly without oxygen. Expeditions were not halted, but climbers everywhere were reminded of the razor-thin margin between achievement and catastrophe. Training regimens, acclimatization schedules, and safety measures became topics of renewed discussion in the mountaineering community. High-altitude records are seductive. They promise glory, history, and the rush of outpacing nature itself. But they are also unforgiving. Artemov's ascent ended not with cheers but with silence, a stark reminder that the mountain does not negotiate. Every record leaves a number behind. Some, like Sergei Artemov, leave a name etched into history for the wrong reason. Every world record leaves a number behind. Some leave a name carved into history for the wrong reason. Please click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.